This is the lecture for the Canterbury Tales, and we're going to start off talking about Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer lived from 1342 to about 1400, and in his early life he had some ties to the royal court. His father and his grandfather were winemakers, and they were loosely attached to the court because that was important to people who lived at the court. They had connections rather than any kind of official position at the court. He was a page in the household of the Countess of Ulster. She was the wife of one of the sons of King Edward III. He was also captured in France during the Hundred Years' War and ransomed by the king, so we can tell that he was some kind of important figure if the king actually did ransom him. As for life at the court, he was a courtier, which is a person that's in attendance at the court, is allowed to be in the court, and eventually he attended the king. Later on, he married this lady here. This is Philippa de Roe, and she was an attendant of the queen and the sister-in-law of John of Gaunt. That was another son of Edward III, who was Chaucer's patron. Between 1370 and 1380, Chaucer made 7 diplomatic trips abroad in the king's service. So he went abroad on behalf of the king. He went to France, Italy, and Spain. And we know that he read French, Latin, Anglo-Norman, and Italian. So he was an educated man. So Chaucer's audience was the court, and that had some implications for his writing, for what we know about him. He wrote for high society. These were the educated members of the royal court. It was not just the general public like Shakespeare wrote for. These were the educated members of the court. So they were mainly highly educated, sophisticated, worldly. They had traveled. They knew advanced humor instead of just kind of street humor that Shakespeare's audience would have been. Chaucer's works would have been read aloud since it was very, very rare to own books. It was very expensive to write books because they were all copied by hand until the printing press was invented. Chaucer used sophisticated literary devices. That means that these are things that people would have understood at the time. Things like classical allusions. An allusion is a reference to some work in the past to make an example of something in the present. So, for example, you would use a biblical allusion by referring to a Bible story. Maybe you were talking about the wisdom of someone, and you would talk about King Solomon from the Bible as being wise. That was a classical allusion. He used subtle satire. Satires making fun of someone. Irony. Ironic situations, saying one thing meaning the other, and his audience understood these devices. He didn't have to explain them to him. He didn't have to dumb things down for them. He was very important in English literature, so we're wondering, why are we even going to read him? Well, he was the first poet of high rank to write in English since Anglo-Saxon times. We need to remember that English had at least 5 different dialects. Some of these varied so much that people from different regions could hardly understand one another. You can still see this today. If you go to England, there are people who have British accents, but then there are also what we see as like street people. They have Cockney accents, and you can barely understand what they're saying. They're different dialects from different regions, and English had 5 different dialects at this time. It was almost like 5 different languages. Latin was also an important language. It was the standard official European language, both for politics and for the church. And so that you know that Latin was even important in the United States in Catholic Church services up until probably the 1960s, 1970s. Chaucer wrote in the English dialect that was called the London dialect. This is what eventually evolved into modern English. So let's take a pause for a second and talk about the history of the English language. Old English went from about 597 to 1100. It had a very Germanic or Danish quality. And so everything was very guttural sounding in the back of your throat. And Beowulf was the chief or literary work of the time. If you haven't read any of Beowulf, there's actually a more cartoonish version of that is available as a movie. It's about a monster that comes in to a town, attacks the king. It's a very, very interesting story. but it was written in Old English and it was the chief literary work. It was the one that everyone retold over and over again. Then Middle English ran from about 1100 to 1500. So that period of about 400 years had a very strong French influence. One of the reasons it had such a strong influence was because of the Battle of Hastings. Battle of Hastings took place in 1066, and it was between William, who was the Duke of Normandy, and Harold, who was the English king. Now, the Duke of Normandy, Normandy is in France, so William was French, and he was fighting an English king. William ended up becoming King of England. He won that battle. Because of this, approximately 10,000 French words were assimilated into the English language through the Normans. So lots and lots of French influence. Chaucer and the court all spoke French. They knew French, so you will see that in his works as well. The Canterbury Tales is considered the masterpiece of Middle English literature. It is one of the reasons that we're reading it, but also because, as we spoke about in class, it is also one of the books that most often makes a banned book list. Modern English then runs from 1500 to the present, and if you look at this carefully, you will see that Shakespeare was written in modern English, not in Old English, not in Middle English. There's a depiction of the Battle of Hastings from 1066. Again, William versus Harold. We have a French king who is now ruling England. Lots and lots of words in the English language because of that. So let's talk for a minute about the poetry and structure of the Canterbury Tales. Almost all of the tales are in the form of a narrative verse. Narrative means it tells a story. Verse means it rhymes. So there are two kinds of rhymes that are used in the Canterbury Tales in the original version. First part is called rhymed couplets. These are every other line, the ends of two lines will rhyme. Line 1 and line 2 rhyme, line 3 and line 4 rhyme. Then there's rhyme royale, which is the 7-line stanza rhyming, and there's the rhyme scheme. So all of the A's rhyme, all of the B's, and all of the C's. It's quite difficult to write in this kind of way. There are also, it was also written in iambic pentameter, and that means that there are 5 units of rhythm per line of poetry, 5 units of rhythm, and each rhythm is called an iambic rhythm. That's unstressed stress. So you would read that as ba-bum, ba-bum. So 5 units is ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. That's what the line sounds like when you read it aloud. The other thing about the structure of the Canterbury Tales, it is a frame story. It's a story within a story. The larger stories is that the characters in the Canterbury Tales are on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, and each one is telling their own story. So we'll see the detailed story, and then we'll back up to the main story of these pilgrims going on a pilgrimage. It begins with a prologue, and that's a separate introductory section that talks about all of the characters, talks about why they're on the journey, why they set up this competition, introduces all of the characters who are on the trip, and then what follows is really a series of dramatic monologues. Each tale then has its own introduction, which is a prologue, or it has an end link. An end link is a conversation of the pilgrims between each one of the tales. So in the prologue, it'll talk about who this person was, the information that you'll hear the characters talk to each other, and then there's the tale itself. Although Chaucer worked on this book for over 20 years, we have only the main prologue and 24 tales of it. The plan was for each pilgrim, 30 pilgrims in all, to tell 2 tales on the way to Canterbury and 2 tales on the way back. 30 pilgrims telling 2 tales on the way and 2 on the way back. And so you'll need to figure out what is the total amount of tales that was going to be told in this book. It is an unfinished piece of work. The purpose for the Canterbury Tales is fun, not reality, because of course people don't usually talk in rhymed couplets except when they're singing. No one would actually hear a tale that was told to 30 people who are all on horseback in open country. It's hard enough to hear each one of you as you walk down the hallways talking to each other and maintaining a conversation. Imagine open country on horseback, 30 people, and you're trying to hear stories that each person is telling, and it's being written down word for word. So a Canterbury tale later came to mean a tall tale. Chaucer also uses an ironic undertone. So he uses sarcasm. Sarcasm is using exaggerated praise to imply the opposite. Oh, you are so smart. That's sarcasm. Irony is saying the opposite of what is really meant, or having an outcome that is opposite of the one expected. You'll see that in the first tale that we're going to read as well. So Chaucer's purpose, it's to present a cross-section of society of the day. All levels of society except royalty are included. There are three ideal portraits, three ideal sections of society, one representing each of these three social classes. So the first would be the knight. The knight represents the nobility, that's the social class. He is a high-minded adventurer serving just causes. The second is the parson. He represents the clergy, that's a social class, remember. That's a humble parish priest who practices what he preaches. And we'll see if all of the priests that are listed in the Canterbury Tales act according to that. We'll see if all the knights are high-minded and act in that way. And finally, the cross-section of the commoners. This would be represented by the plowman. And ideally, he is supposed to be a dutiful worker who lives in peace and perfect charity. We'll see if he's actually satisfied with his life. We'll see if that's good for him. The station of his life is good for him, or if we will see if those characters that represent the commoners are actually different. So pilgrimages during the time, those are journeys for religious purposes. And the trip to Canterbury was actually a real journey. It was very popular in Chaucer's time. The distance was from London to Canterbury, and they either walked or went on horse, and it was about 60 miles. That took about 4 to 5 days to go either on horseback or by walking. This particular journey in the Canterbury Tales, we find out, took place from April 16th to 20th, and it started at Southwark. That's a suburb of London. Harry Bailey is the man that we find out is the guide in Canterbury Tales. He was a guy that they hired to take them from London to Canterbury over this 4 to 5 days. He was a real innkeeper at Southwark. He was an actual guy. So they used him in this, Chaucer used him in this book as a representative. So in the book there are 29 pilgrims plus the narrator. That would be 30 people in all. The goal of these pilgrimages, the goal of London to Canterbury, was the shrine of St. Thomas of Becket. St. Thomas of Becket lived from 1118, about then, to 1170, and he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He actually has a really interesting tale. He was a friend and companion in luxurious and riotous living of King Henry II. They partied all the time. Henry then appointed him the Chancellor of England in 1155. Well, Thomas became a bishop in 1162. He joined the church, and he gave up his sinful habits. He championed the church and the people against the king, formerly his friend. So a series of conflicts with the king followed, and one day the frustrated king said, he wished someone would rid him of Thomas. Well, 4 knights rode to Canterbury and murdered Thomas on the steps of the church during a service on December 29th of 1170. Thomas became a saint 2 years later. There's a movie called Becket that's a very good representation of the relationship between King Henry II and Thomas Becket. I would encourage any of you to get that. It's an older film, but it's well worth watching and learning about them. Finally, our last slide, why people went on pilgrimages. There are 5 main reasons why they went on pilgrimages. First, they went for religious inspiration. Second, as a social event or entertainment. Remember, they didn't have an enormous amount of entertainment options during that time. Third was they felt it might cure illnesses, so you went on a pilgrimage on behalf of somebody. Number 4 was to impress the neighbors. This was for a status symbol. And finally, for the saint's blessing. If you're interested in learning some more about pilgrimages, I would encourage you to have a short conversation with Miss Vaca. She has been on the Camino in Spain and in Portugal for the last few years. She can tell you what it's like to go from shrine to shrine and to go on one of these pilgrimages. That's the end of our lecture.